We will this evening finish up our introduction to the book of Revelation so that the next time we gather we can actually begin to move through the book. It might seem to you rather lengthy to have so many sessions of introduction, but I don't think any book of the Bible would justify so many hours spent introducing it as the book of Revelation does, because there are so many aspects that confuse and perplex, and therefore my attempt here is to remove as much of those obstacles as possible before we start going through. And we've talked about the authorship, we've talked about the genre of literature that it is, we've talked about the symbolism in the book, we've talked about the debate over the date of writing, which is significant. At least it is determinative in some cases with some of the possible interpretations. The date of writing is everything. That is, one position in particular, the preterist position, stands or falls based on the date of writing. Now, having referred to one position, the preterist position, I just give that as an example, but there are 4 different approaches to the book of Revelation, and these are entirely different from one another. It's like they almost have no overlap in terms of their thought about interpretation. It's possible that you have heard various teachers on Revelation give various viewpoints on it, but all of them from the futurist viewpoint, so that some would think that the rapture occurs at the beginning of Revelation. Some think it happens at the end of Revelation. There are some put the rapture in chapter 4, some put the rapture in chapter 19. Some place it in the middle, around chapter 11. Or maybe 12. And so in hearing these different views, if you happen to have heard them, you might say, wow, there's sure a lot of disagreement about the book of Revelation. Well, you haven't heard the least of it yet. Because those who place the rapture in Revelation 4 and those who place it in chapter 19 are much closer to each other in their interpretation of Revelation than either of them are to any of the other 3 views. Because those who place the rapture anywhere in Revelation are taking, in that case, generally speaking, a futurist view, or in some cases an idealist view. But I'm assuming that if you are like me and like 90% or more of American evangelicals, you probably have heard the futurist view of Revelation, and perhaps no other. In fact, it may be that you never had any reason to think there was any other kind of view. What is the futurist view? It is the view that Revelation is talking about the future. Now, if you had told me that sometime in the first 8 years of my ministry, if you'd said, well, the futurist view is the view that Revelation is talking about the future, I'd say, well, duh, what else could it be talking about? You don't think that there's ever been a time in history, do you, when a bottomless pit was opened and a swarm of locusts with scorpion tails afflicted the human race? Do you? Obviously that's future. It's never happened before, has it? How about the whole sea turning to blood? Clearly that's never happened. That must be future. But you see, the assumption I was making is that those things are literal. And if they are literal, then of course they must not have happened yet. Seems like we would have heard about it. And so the idea that the book of Revelation is future rests on the idea that it is literal. That's one reason we spent a whole session talking about the symbolism in the book and pointing out that although some people say, well, we have to take the book of Revelation literally like the rest of Scripture, they don't really do so. They take literally what they want to take literally, and other things they don't. Nobody takes literally the beast being a real animal, or Jesus being a real lamb. No one takes that literally. No one thinks Jesus is a lamb, or that the world will be ruled by an animal. And so they would recognize symbolism there, and so what we really have to deal with is deciding how much of this is symbolic. And then, of course, once having made some assessments in that area, what do the symbols referred to? And how closely do they have to correspond with the events they're referring to? That is, do they have to be kind of like the event? Or can they be just kind of have a distant connection in principle with whatever it's talking about? These kinds of decisions are not easy to make. And it makes it all the harder when you realize that it's not a given among biblical scholars that there's any particular time period that this is talking about. It's so much easier to be a futurist, because then you can just take anything literal that can't be taken literally. And that's exactly when I was a futurist, what I would have said. I would have said, if someone said, well, you don't take it all literally, I said, well, no, some things it would be ridiculous to take them literally. But you take everything literally unless it's absurd to take it literally. But then, of course, one man's judgment of absurdity is different than another man's. And the older I get, the fewer things there are in the book of Revelation that I would find it possible to take literally without seeing an absurdity in it. When I was young, I believed everything I was told. That's a good thing to do when you're young, but only while you're young. And then you need to do some thinking on your own. And my thinking led me far from my roots in the book of Revelation. I taught the futurist view for the first 8 years of my ministry. But near the end of that 8 years, some of those final years, I was a little waffly. In fact, I'll tell you, I was, let's see, it was probably 4 years into my ministry that I began to see some problems with the futurist view. I did not consider them to be fatal problems. They were just difficulties I couldn't resolve. Passages that didn't seem to fit. Statements that didn't make an awful lot of sense from a futurist point of view. But I didn't know there's any other view out there. I truly did not believe any Christian had ever seen the book of Revelation otherwise than as a description of the end of the world. But in spite of the fact that some of the things in the book of Revelation were hard to fit into that milieu, I just figured it certainly must be about the end of the world, but I can't understand how then these particular statements would fit. So the decision I made, and I consciously made this when I was, it was in 1974. I went in the ministry in 70, so I was 4 years into it, and I had been a solid dispensationalist, futurist, and I decided I can live the rest of my life without teaching the book of Revelation. After all, the church went 4 centuries without having it in the canon. It must be possible to be a good Christian without knowing what the book of Revelation is about or even having it in your Bible. So I don't need to teach the book of Revelation. I just had concluded that I don't understand it, and I probably will not. I had understood it when I just mouthed what my teachers had said. They seemed to understand everything. But some of the things that I repeated eventually didn't seem to fit with the text itself. And I became less and less confident in my viewpoint till I thought, okay, I really just don't know. I didn't have anything to replace the futurist view with. I didn't know there were any other options, so I just thought, I just don't get it. But, so what? I had by this time in my ministry come to think that the most important thing for a Bible teacher to be concerned about is discipleship. Making disciples. Teaching them to observe all things whatsoever Jesus commanded. This is what we're told to teach. And I thought, well, I can do that without teaching the book of Revelation. I don't need to. I assumed when I was 20 years old, or 21 years old, I assumed that I was done teaching the book of Revelation. And I thought, that's okay. I don't need to teach it. It can be there. It can be sort of the black box of the Bible that I don't have to intrude into. We can get on just fine with the other 65 books. And so I put Revelation out of my mind as much as I could. The problem was I kept reading the other 65 books. And as I mentioned in a previous lecture, the other 65 books are alluded to in the book of Revelation hundreds of times. Which meant that as I read other books of the Bible, I'd come across passages that I remembered were in the book of Revelation. I remembered Revelation had said something like that. And it would make me curious. For example, the first thing along these lines I came across as I was teaching in 1978 in a school in Santa Cruz, a discipleship school I ran during the summer times there, 12 weeks long. You think 10 weeks, last summer was long, it was 12 weeks each summer I taught this. And I was teaching through the Bible as I am here, only much more, like 6 hours a day, because we tried to get through fast. And besides, I didn't know much, so it didn't take long to get through the material. But I remember teaching in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus' statement that he had bound the strong man, that is Satan. He said, no man can enter a strong man's house and spoil his goods unless he first binds the strong man. And then he can spoil his house. I knew the context. I knew he was talking about casting demons out. He was spoiling or plundering Satan's house. And his affirmation was that I am doing what no one could possibly do unless they first bound Satan. No one can go into Satan's house and do there what I'm doing here unless he has first bound, incapacitated the strong man, that is, bound Satan. And as I reflected on that, for the first time it occurred to me that Jesus said he had bound Satan. And I thought, well, I remember something else about Satan being bound. Oh yeah, that's in that difficult book. It's in Revelation chapter 20. But I thought, well, wait, Jesus is going to bind Satan at the beginning of the millennium when Jesus comes back. But in Matthew 12, he said he had already bound him. So I thought, Jesus bound Satan in his first coming, and he's going to bind him again at his second coming. How did Satan get loose in between? This was my exact thinking. I thought, what? Okay, he got bound back then. He'll be bound again when Jesus comes back. What happened in between that he got loose and has to be bound again? Who let him loose? I wasn't being facetious. That was truly a crisis for me. And I had to ask, what I actually asked myself is it possible that Revelation 20 is talking about the same binding of Satan that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 12:28? And that got me thinking very differently, because if so, that means Revelation 20 isn't talking about the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. It might be talking about the first coming of Christ. And then, of course, that raises a lot of other questions I won't go into detail now. Maybe when we get to chapter 20, I'll go through it all with you. But the point is, I was trying to avoid Revelation. I was not interested in teaching Revelation. I was reading other parts of the Bible, but I kept running into the material that's in the book of Revelation in other parts of the Bible. And it seemed to be, as I was, I guess, reading without any prejudices about the book of Revelation, perhaps, it was taking me back to look at the passages that cross-reference, and eventually I found that I had made some sense out of one chapter, and that was chapter 20 initially. Later, around 1982, 12 years into my ministry, when I first began teaching for YWAM, I was in Australia, actually teaching in Brisbane, and in my free time I was reading something like John. And in John chapter 12 and verse 31, Jesus said, now is the judgment of this world, now shall the ruler of this world be cast out. He said, now will the ruler of this world, I had no doubt that was Satan, because Jesus used that phrase, the ruler of this world, 3 times, and every time meant Satan. So he says, now Satan's going to be cast out? And I thought, well, in Revelation 12, which, see, I couldn't get away from Revelation because I knew it. I knew Revelation, I just didn't understand it, and so I kept remembering things. Revelation 12 has the dragon being cast out. But I thought that's supposed to happen in the middle of the tribulation, but Jesus said it was going to happen at the cross. And so this is really tweaking me, because I really had never heard anyone suggest anything about the Revelation other than it was all about the end of the world, and the things I was seeing and cross-referencing were giving me a different picture, but I wasn't sure what that picture looked like. It wasn't total, it was piece by piece. I think chapter 12 was the next chapter of Revelation that made some sense to me. Now there were 2 out of 22 chapters that made sense to me. The rest I couldn't make any sense of at all. And I wasn't trying. And so, you know, my pastor in my early years of ministry had always said, just read through the Bible, don't get hung up on the parts you don't understand. He said, if you come across something that just doesn't make sense to you, don't let that stop you in your pursuit through the Bible. He says, just take that little tidbit and put it back in the cupboard and leave it for later. Someday it'll make sense to you. Well, I had been doing that, especially with things about Bible prophecy, because what I did is what many Christians did. I assumed that Revelation was about the end of the world, and then I used it as a framework to set up a paradigm of the end of the world, and then fit what Paul and Jesus and Isaiah and Daniel said into the framework that I had formed from the book of Revelation. In other words, I started with the most obscure book in the Bible to make my framework. And then even scriptures that should have been more clear were made unclear because I had to fit them into the framework. I had to shoehorn them in there. But I was doing that less and less, of course, when I realized I can't use the book of Revelation because I don't know what it's about. And so what happened was I had more and more of these things I had to put back in the cupboard in my head. I had this, this junk drawer in my brain that all these pieces that didn't fit the picture had to be thrown into. And so eventually, after several years, I had a lot of puzzle pieces in that drawer. Lots of things that just didn't fit the picture. And I decided one day to take all the pieces out and look at them and see if they fit each other by any means. They didn't fit my picture, but they might fit together with each other. And as I began to look at these pieces again, in light of each other, I began to say, wait, there's a picture forming here. I was trying to make a jigsaw puzzle. I thought it was a Forest Glen picture, but it turned out it was a horse pasture, something entirely different than what I thought. I had this idea of what the picture of Revelation was about, but I had all these parts that didn't fit, but they fit each other. And I began to wonder, maybe my whole picture is wrong. Maybe there's a different picture that everything does fit. And that intrigued me. And this was well into the 1980s now. Over a decade after I'd gone into the ministry, I had already become an amillennialist, so I didn't know that's what it was called. Because no one else I knew had ever been one. I had, by my own thinking through and comparing scripture to scripture, I'd become an amillennialist. I later learned that's what it was called. And I later learned there were others. I didn't know there were others. It scared me. I was quite convinced that I had become a heretic and that I should not only not teach the book of Revelation, but I had better never say anything about the millennium again, because it would certainly, brand me, and my ministry would be over. So I was keeping good and silent about the millennium for a while. Of course, I'll just tell you, to make a long story short, I later found out that was not my own view alone. It was the view of the whole church through most of history. So that made me feel a little better, and I felt I could come out of the closet. But I still was working on what Revelation is about. Revelation 20 I had no problems with. The other chapters presented difficulties. Someone gave me a book called More Than Conquerors by William Hendrickson, a Dutch Reformed scholar. And he was amillennial, as I was, but more than that, he had an entirely different paradigm of Revelation. His view was what we call the idealist view. I'd never heard anything other than the futurist view, so this was intriguing. And the idealist view, as he presented it, was very well presented, very convincing, and fit perfectly the amillennial position I had already come to years earlier. So it felt right. It felt like a fit. And so for a little while I started coming out and teaching on Revelation somewhat, but from the idealist point of view, which is, by the way, a very satisfying point of view. It's intellectually satisfying. But I knew only two views, the futurist view and the idealist. And with those as the only options I knew, I was quite sure the idealist must be the right one, because the futurist had come to seem totally nonsensical to me in view of other scripture. And so I was an idealist. Somebody handed me a book back in 1982, I believe it was. Yes, it was, 82 or 83. Someone gave me a book by J. Adams called The Time Is at Hand. Now, J. Adams is a Presbyterian author, amillennial, and he's not generally a teacher or a preacher or writer about prophecies. He made his fame from writing about biblical counseling. In 1970, he published a book called Competent to Counsel, which was enormously successful and launched a movement in the evangelical church called the Nouthetic Counseling Movement. John MacArthur's Schoolmaster's Seminary has a whole department of Nouthetic Counseling. Jay Adams was the father of Nouthetic Counseling, which essentially was just counseling from Scripture, is what it came down to instead of psychology. But anyway, Jay Adams had written many books about counseling and was sort of the guru on that subject, but he had written a small book on Revelation and the Olivet Discourse called The Time Is at Hand. He was a preterist. He believed that the first half of Revelation was describing the fall of Jerusalem. The first 12 chapters, he thought, or the first 11 chapters were about the fall of Jerusalem. He believed that the chapters 12 through 19 were about the fall of Rome. And chapter 20 he took the same way I did, which was satisfying. But his preterism was radical to me. He was not idealist, he was not futurist. He was saying Revelation had already been fulfilled in the past. An idea I would never have considered some years earlier. But being an idealist had led me to take things in the book of Revelation non-literally. When I actually broke free from the literal idea, then I was open to think of other possible interpretations of the symbols, and preterism made some sense. He said that Jerusalem and Rome were the two enemies of the early church. The first persecutor of the church was Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin had Jesus killed, stoned Stephen, sent Saul out to persecute the church, and then persecuted him when he became a Christian. The persecutor of the church in Smyrna seemed to be the Jewish community there. The persecutor of the church in Philadelphia also in Revelation seems to be the Jewish community. Jews persecuted Christians in the early days. It's hard for us to imagine that because in later history the church became politically powerful and persecuted Jews. And we think of the Jews having suffered a great deal under the church, and they have. But in the early days, they didn't. The church didn't persecute anyone because they were Christians then. Christians don't persecute people. Institutional churches do it as a habit, but Christians don't. And the early Christians didn't persecute Jews. The Jews persecuted the early Christians until about 70 AD. After that, Rome became the real persecutor of the church, of course. The emperors did. And so, according to Jay Adams, Revelation is showing God's dealings, God's intention to judge the two great persecutors of the early church, Jerusalem and Rome. He felt that Babylon, who appears only in the second half of Revelation, is Rome. A good case can be made for that. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 5, sends greetings from the church in Babylon. And most tradition says he was in Rome, which means that he might have been using the word Babylon as a name for Rome. And so if Revelation used the word Babylon for Rome, that would be consistent with what Peter did. So anyway, this made some sense. But I'll tell you, it was still a little far-fetched for me. It was so new, so radical. As I read his book, I thought, that's interesting, that's convincing, that makes sense. But when I put the book down, I thought, nah, I don't think so. It was just too different. And so I put it aside. I was glad to know it was there. I was glad to know what some of the arguments for the preterist view were, but I remained not totally convinced. So I fell back on my default, which was at that time the idealist view. In the middle 80s, I was given a book called The Parousia by J. Stuart Russell. He wrote it in the 1800s. It was so controversial, he felt, that he actually issued it anonymously. He published it, first of all, anonymously. However, the first edition was very popular and well received, so he later put out a second edition with his name on it and came out and identified himself. He was a full preterist. I didn't know that when I read his book. I just knew that he was seeing 70 AD in lots of places I'd never seen it, and he made a very convincing case for the Olivet Discourse and much of Revelation and some other passages even in the Old Testament as having been referring to 70 AD. I didn't understand until later that he thought there was no future second coming of Christ and that he believed all prophecy had been fulfilled in 70 AD, which I consider to be an error. I don't believe that he's correct about that. But I found myself agreeing with him about 50% of the time in his book. He took every instance in the Bible that uses the word parousia, which is the word coming, of the coming of Christ. And he showed in each case that it referred to 70 AD. Well, like I say, I agreed with him about half the time. His reasoning was very good in about half the cases. The other half, I thought, it's a stretch. But I think mostly through reading his book, and then, of course, some other preterist books got in my hands, which, what it really took was someone had to tell me what really happened in 70 AD. I had never been taught in 30 years of being a Christian, 15 of which I've been in the ministry. I'd never been told anything about what happened in 70 AD. I vaguely knew that the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem sometime around that time, and that was all I knew. I knew there was a guy named Josephus, who was a historian who'd written something, but I only knew that he'd made some references to Jesus and so forth that were helpful in Christian apologetics. I didn't really know much about Josephus' work. I didn't realize Josephus had participated in the Jewish war and wrote a history of it in detail. And these preterist writers tended to quote Josephus a lot. And it was an eye-opener because Josephus was not a Christian. He was a Jew, a witness of the Jewish war, and he had never certainly had a chance to see the book of Revelation, but many of the historical paragraphs recalling things that happened in the Jewish war, they look like they paralleled Revelation to an extremely close degree. And so I became fairly convinced that Revelation probably had a lot to do with 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. So I became a partial preterist. By this time, I had been three different things: a futurist, an idealist, and now a partial preterist. There is a fourth view. I have not become that. Not yet. That's the historicist view. And I don't think I will become that. But I thought, well, I'd better look into all the views. Now that I was aware there were a lot of views, I found out that the reformers, all the guys that the Protestants admire, like Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and all those reformers, and Wycliffe and Huss, they were historicists. Their approach to the Revelation was historicist. They were not futurists, they were not idealists, they were not preterists. They were historicists. And so I thought I'd better look into that. I couldn't find any modern books on it except those published by Seventh-day Adventists, and their interpretations were not impressive. But some of the older commentaries, like Matthew Henry, or Adam Clark, or some of the guys that I was very familiar with but hadn't really read what they said about Revelation. Barnes' notes on the New Testament. I had Barnes' notes. He was about the most thorough commentator on the New Testament I could find, a Presbyterian. These turned out to all be historicists. They were Protestant classic historicists, like the Reformers. And so I became acquainted with that and realized they had a pretty good case too. Not good enough for me, but pretty good. Now by this time I had become aware there were four different views of Revelation: the futurist, the idealist, the preterist, and the historicist. I also knew from experience that at least three of these could make a convincing case, or at least had convinced me at one time or another, and that the historicists, which had not convinced me, still had a pretty good case, enough to convince all Protestants for several centuries. The historicist view, the one I've never held and do not really anticipate holding, actually was called the Protestant view, because from the Reformation on, every Protestant scholar and preacher held to the historicist case until the 1800s, where there was a renewal of interest in the futurists. And so, I mean, what it comes down to is every one of these views has had some pretty impressive guys championing it, and every one of them felt they could make a strong case, strong enough to convince them and many others that their view is correct. But they were all mutually exclusive. Well, maybe not. The idealist view could coexist with any of the other three, but the other three were definitely mutually exclusive. And this is very confusing. But since I had decided long ago I don't have to teach Revelation anymore, I had the luxury of not being confused. I had the luxury of just being undecided. I didn't have to know, because I don't have to teach it. But I was interested, it was fascinating really, to see how strong a case each of these views could make. And when I started the Great Commission School in Oregon in 1983, I had become aware of some of these views. Well, I was aware of three of them at that time, and maybe vaguely aware of the fourth. And I had to teach through the book of Revelation every year in that school. But I but only because I had to teach the whole Bible. I mean, I would have gladly left Revelation out. That's what Calvin did. Calvin wrote commentaries on every book of the Bible except Revelation. Smart man. I could have run a school. We go through the whole Bible up through Jude. You have to go elsewhere to learn about Revelation. Well, I didn't think that'd draw many students. So I said, we'll go through the whole Bible. And that meant I was obliged to teach the book of Revelation. I thought, well, how can I teach it? I don't know what it means. So I decided I'll teach all the views. I'll just put them side by side, tell people what the arguments are, and let them make up their own minds. I don't care what they end up believing. I don't even know what I believe. I'll just give them all the facts. That way, they won't be mad at me later. Now, what I meant by that is I was kind of mad at my teachers who had only told me the futurist view. I kind of thought that wasn't very fair. They had never said, now we're going to go through the book of Revelation and we take here the futurist view, which we consider to be the best of the various views. I never heard anything even like that. We just said, the book of Revelation means this. Never any suggestion that anyone had ever thought otherwise, or that any intelligent person could ever consider another view. When I found out that was not the case, it made me angry. I'm not a very angry person, so it's not like I blew up, but it made me resentful. I thought, my teachers cheated me. It took me many years to find out what they could have told me. That is, that there's different views, and I could have, maybe by now I'd know which one was right if they'd told me about it. Instead, I have to kind of figure it out myself. And I thought, one thing I don't want is to have a bunch of students go through the Bible with me and come out later, someday, years later, and say, why didn't Steve tell me about this view? How come Steve only told me this view, the one he holds? And so I thought, well, an educator doesn't indoctrinate, an educator educates. And so I will educate my students. I'll tell them all four views. So I went out looking for the book that would compare these views. Because I thought it'd be good to, easier, you know. I didn't want to have lots of commentaries to consult, because I'd have to read lots of commentaries to find out all the views in detail, enough to teach them. And so I started searching for the book that would compare the four views, side by side. Certainly there was one. I eventually found over 100 commentaries on Revelation in print at a Bible college library, which I actually used to do the research for my book. They had over 100 commentaries on Revelation. Apparently Revelation had gotten a lot of attention from scholars, but no one had ever compared the views side by side, so that a reader could just say, right across the page, okay, this view, this view, this view, this view of this passage. And I thought, this is seemingly a tremendous oversight. And I thought it cannot be true. I thought, out there somewhere, someone has done this. It's been 2,000 years, for crying out loud. Somebody will have done this. There are parallels of the Gospels. Lots of people have done parallels of the Gospels. Certainly someone's done parallels of the views of Revelation. It was never done. And that is why I contacted a number of publishers and asked if they would like to have a book like that written. And I found one that did, and so I wrote it, but I didn't want to write it. I mean, Revelation's the book I didn't want to teach anything about. It's the book I wanted to ignore, and it ends up being the only book I've ever written a commentary on. But anyway, at least now no one can say I left them in the dark. And if you don't have time to read my commentary or don't want to buy it, I'll give you my views for free. But you have to come out to these meetings. Right now I want to tell you what the four views are, what the strengths and weaknesses of each of them are, and of course be as objective as I can. I've already told you something about my leanings, but not everything. I'll tell you right now, my leanings are partial preterist, partial idealist. And as we go through the book of Revelation, I will justify my position in each case. But that is the case. Part of the book of Revelation I take preterist. Part of it I take idealist. I suppose a very, very small part I could say I take futurist, because I do believe the second coming of Christ, the future one, is in there. But not much. It's not mostly about that. So I kind of mix and match, but not randomly. But generally for very good reasons, I think. Okay, so let's talk about these views. Let's talk about the historicist view first. For the simple reason it's the oldest, as near as we can tell. People have asked me, what did the earliest Christians think about Revelation? The answer is, we can't really know. They didn't tell us. They might have written on it, but their works have not survived. The earliest commentary on Revelation that has survived is from the 3rd century, and it takes a view that seems to be like the historicist view, in a way. What is the historicist view? The historicist view is the idea that the book of Revelation is God writing the whole history of the church in advance, revealing to John the whole age of the church, a panorama of the entire period from John's day to the second coming of Christ. And that as you go through the book of Revelation, you are moving forward through church history from John's day, and when you get to the end, you're at the end of the world, the second coming of Christ. So it's not believing that the book is about the future or the past, but both and everything in between. And they believe this, that the 7 seals, which appear early in the book, as they are broken, they correspond to the breakdown of the Roman Empire. Some preterists, some historicists, like Adam Clarke, sees that as possibly a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. But most historicists, think it's the Roman Empire. So the 7 seals being broken are the breakdown of the Roman Empire, especially as it fell to the barbarian hordes, the Goths, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals and the Huns and so forth. The downfall of Rome, Western Empire, is in the 7 seals. Then you have the 7 trumpets. Those, they believe, tell us of the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, especially to the Islamists, the Mohammedan invasions. Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, fell to the Islamists, to the followers of Muhammad. On this view, the 5th trumpet, which brings the locusts are the Muslim hordes coming against Constantinople. And so we lose Rome and the Western Empire in the 7 seals. We lose Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire in the 7 trumpets. In the midst of that, there's concern about the rise of the papacy. The papacy rose in the late 6th, early 7th century, and the historicist believes that the papacy is seen in the beast. The beast in Revelation 13 is the papacy, and persecutes the saints, which would be all dissenters from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, here's one of the things the historicist view says, and that is that the book of Revelation follows a prophetic rule called the year for a day rule. Year for a day, or day for a year, means that when you read of a day, it really means a year. They say this is established in the Old Testament. Where? Well, they always give 2 examples. Not good ones, but they are 2 examples they always give. It's all they can give. One is when Moses sent the children of Israel in to spy out, the 12 spies to spy out the land of Canaan. They did so for 40 days. When the people rebelled, God said, I'm going to give you a year in the wilderness for every day that they spied out the land. They were there 40 days, you're going to wander for 40 years. So we see the year for a day. Now, any thinking person should be able to see that while it is true that they received a year wandering for each day they spied, that in no sense establishes some rule of prophetic interpretation. It's not even relevant. The other example they give is more relevant, and that is that Ezekiel was told to lie on one side for 390 days, and on his other side for 40 days, and he was told that each of those days represented a year. 390 days represent 390 years of the judgment upon Judah, and 40 days represented 40 years of judgment upon Israel, if I recall correctly. And so for each day that he lay on his side, it represented a year of God's judgment. That is, in fact, of course, a true correspondence in a prophetic action. However, not anywhere near enough to establish the principle that this is how we're supposed to interpret prophecy. No one does that with any of the other numbers in prophecy, or yet these two things have encouraged the historicists to say a day equals a year. Now, where this comes in handy for them, the locusts afflict men for 5 months. A month is 30 days. The Jewish calendar, that's 150 days. And they point out a beginning and an end of the Muslim attacks and invasions and collapse of Constantinople. They figured out to be exactly 150 years. Well, the locusts afflict for 150 days, or 5 months. And they apply this also to the papacy. The beast's blasphemies continue for 1,260 days. Now, if that's literal, it's 3.5 years. But the historians say that is 1,260 years, not days. And so with the rise of the papacy, about 600 AD, with Pope Gregory the Great, they measured forward 1,260 years and said the papacy is going to fall somewhere about the year 1860. That's because the papacy is only going to last 1,260 years. Now, you can see why, with that kind of reckoning, the historicist view could survive into the 19th century. But it has pretty much fizzled out since then. The Seventh-day Adventists grew out of a movement led by William Miller, the Millerites, who were historicists, as the Seventh-day Adventists still are. But the Millerites used these calculations to actually calculate the very day that Jesus would come back and judge the papacy. So the Millerites actually sold their property, put on white robes, went out on the hillside and waited for Jesus to come back. The fact that he didn't is actually, in church history, has been called the Great Disappointment. And actually, that's the technical term that historians use for the Millerites' disillusionment when Jesus didn't come back. It was called the Great Disappointment. Somehow the Seventh-day Adventist Church survived it. The Millerites didn't. But the Seventh-day Adventists are just about the only group around today who are still historicists. And the Seventh-day Adventists advertise in laundromats these colorful posters saying Revelation Seminar, has these pictures of dragons and things on it, and come to our seminar and learn about the book of Revelation. If you go to one of the Seventh-day Adventist Revelation seminars, you'll learn the historicist approach. To learn it anywhere else, you have to go to the older Protestant commentaries before the 1800s. Because the historicist view just doesn't really exist anymore, except among the Seventh-day Adventists. And their interpretation isn't anywhere near as sensible as, say, some of the other commentaries were that held it. So the historicist view, by the way, has many points of strength about it. Not the least of which is that many things that happened in history related to the fall of the Roman Empire correspond numerically and in detail to some of the visions in Revelation. For example, Albert Barnes, in Barnes' Notes on the New Testament, a very thorough commentator, Presbyterian pastor who spent some hours every morning of his day writing a few pages, I suppose, of notes, has left a set of books that are just incredibly thorough commentary. When I was writing my book, I read his commentary on Revelation. And in his introduction, he says, when I undertook to write this commentary on Revelation, I decided I would not take any particular view. He says, I knew there were different views out there, and I just determined that I would not take a view. I'll just talk about what's said, what it means, not in terms of fulfillment, but what the words mean and so forth. He was trying to avoid interpreting. But he says, as I read Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Now, Edward Gibbon was the great historian of the Roman Empire and was no Christian. In fact, he was very anti-Christian. He was a very antagonistic anti-Christian historian, but he wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Professor Barnes, or Pastor Barnes, said, he says, as I read Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, I could not help but be struck by the almost verbal parallels to the book of Revelation. And he says, I could not keep my commitment to not interpret, I had to take this view, and he took the historicist view. Throughout his commentary, he points out, he quotes Gibbon, he quotes other historians and details as he's talking about things in Revelation, and they are impressive. There are impressive parallels. There are reasons why the best minds in the Protestant church believed this was the right view. But there were also assumptions they made, for example, the day for a year theory, which doesn't really have an awful lot behind it. And of course, their predictions didn't come true in the 19th century. So the view has pretty much fallen aside. By the way, they thought that the 7 bowl judgments, which Revelation refers to as the 7 last plagues, they considered that's the French Revolution. And they pointed out good reasons for thinking so. The problem is, if so, then Revelation ended at the French Revolution. So the last 250 years have been inconsequential, I guess, not worth mentioning. The last judgments were upon France, or actually on the papacy in France. And so there are things about the historicist view that just didn't wash out right. And so you'll hardly find any historicist now, though it was once called the Protestant view. In fact, it was even held before the Protestant Reformation by Huss and Wycliffe, and even some Catholic orders like the Franciscan order. The Franciscan order actually believed that the Pope was the Antichrist. And this was before there was a Reformation. They were Catholic. But the view was convincing to more than just Protestants, but it was officially the Protestant view. But it's gone now, mostly. I mean, it's interesting reading, very interesting, but I don't find myself capable of taking it seriously, as I probably would have if I was living in 1812 instead of 2012. But anyway, that's the historicist view. And it really does have a lot of people who were impressive, who held it. Essentially everybody who wasn't a Catholic, and many Catholics. By the way, the Catholics had to respond. And what they responded with was preterism and futurism. Now, let's talk about the preterist view.